knew that we need was good education to understand what problems are and what causes them and how can they be addressed, and joy in the midst of mental health crisis, to be empowered to still live and to be able to help others to live even with the struggles that they have. It's a special time for us to be able to also provide support for caregivers, and Enlighten also has a mental health support group that is for those who give care to those who are struggling with mental health problems. Carol's going to share a little bit.
I want to welcome everybody to the Enlighten Mental Health webinar. We are excited to have Dr. Shannae Anderson to join us in person to present God and Our Brain, which she has shared with many audiences. We would like to know from those who are tuning in, so why don't you go check in through the YouTube chat by typing in where you're from. Well, I know there's some people tuning in from Irvine, from Anaheim, also from San Diego, Thousand Oaks, Toronto, Canada, Camarillo, Simi Valley. So those in the audience, please silence your cell phones. Please know taking pictures to keep confidentiality. And for those here, the restaurants are on your left in the hallway. Dr. Anderson will be opening up times for questions throughout her presentation, so type in your questions through Slido, or those in the audience can raise your hands and ask questions, and we'll bring a microphone to you. And the YouTube moderator will post the Slido link on the YouTube chat throughout today, and the Slido link will also be found in the YouTube description. And there's more people, Newbury Park, Thousand Oaks.
It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Shannae Anderson. She is a longtime resident. She came here, she said, when she was 2 years old. And so basically she grew up here in Thousand Oaks and loves this area. She's a graduate. She got her Ph.D. in psychology at USC. And she is currently an adjunct professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. She's also taught at our local CalU in the area of psychology. She's also taught for UCLA Extension. She is a therapist in private practice, and she has helped in our community in helping those who are the survivors of the borderline shooting. And surprisingly, we were also surprised to hear that her son was actually a survivor of the shooting. But now he is, they are proud. He is in the United States Army and is serving the Lord and serving our country. Her husband, Jim, was a major league professional baseball player with the Anaheim Angels. Back then they were called the Anaheim Angels. And we're so glad that he's here with us today. And Shannae has also been the teaching director at CBS. And so she has a tremendous amount of experience, and I know that we'll be blessed as she comes to share with us today. So Dr. Anderson, would you please come?
Thank you so much. Well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank you again for having me here. It was a little bit difficult getting me here. Originally, we were supposed to do this a year ago, and then the lockdowns hit, but I'm really happy to be here. So if you look at the painting behind me, this painting is entitled The Creation of Adam, and it was painted by Michelangelo, and it hangs in the Sistine Chapel, or it's part of the Sistine Chapel paintings that they have there. And in this painting, we see God reaching out to connect to Adam as the masterpiece of his creation. You see God is stretching out his arm to touch kind of the passive arm and life of man. As you can see, God created us all with a desire to connect, because our God is a relational God. Let's open in prayer. Father God, I thank you for this opportunity to be here today. I pray for everyone who is here listening that their hearts and minds would be open to what your Spirit has to share today through me. I pray that Well, Father God, I'm going to finish my prayer and I'm going to ask that you restore all the technical aspects of today. I pray a hedge of protection around this area that the enemy would not be able to touch it. Father, I just pray that your hand would be upon every aspect of this teaching today. In Jesus' name, amen. So I hope you have your notes that you can follow along if you can't see our slides this morning. But we're going to focus initially on how God is a relational God. We know that he's a relational being because he is in relation with himself within the Trinity, that he has a relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Likewise, we know that God has a relationship with us, and God also has a relationship through us with others. There we go. Because our God is a relational being and we are created in his image, we actually are all born with an innate need for relationships. Now, I've got a random question for you. How many of you have ever wondered why we are born as babies? I know it's kind of an odd question that many people probably don't think about. It's one that I've thought about. But if God created Adam and Eve as human adults, why are we born as babies? Why are we born small and helpless and totally dependent on others? It kind of doesn't make sense if you think about it, but I do believe God knew what he was doing when he created us as these very fragile infants. Our ability to form and maintain relationships with God and with other people is actually rooted in this most earliest relationship that we have with our caregivers. We are born, I believe, helpless and dependent in order actually to need others, because in this process of needing others, it activates the attachment bond literally in our brain. So what is attachment? I'm going to give it 3 different parts in our definition. Attachment is a God-given biological-based system that is online at birth. Now, our secularists will not say that it's God-given. They will say it's evolutionary and that it was kind of a Darwin thing, but I firmly believe God has given us this biological need to connect from the moment we are born, and we're going to see a lot more of what that's about. So it's online at birth. Some people are beginning to believe, and we have some research I'll talk a little bit later, about it being online before we're born, when we're actually in utero. Attachment also promotes proximity to an attachment figure to protect from harm and danger. So what does that mean? That means that when we are born, we are so helpless. We can't take care of ourselves as infants. We are at risk from anything around us. And so our parents and caregivers serve as protection to watch over us because we cannot protect ourselves. And so through this attachment bond that we begin to develop with our parents and primary caregivers, that proximity or closeness to that attachment figure keeps us safe. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, I'm going to argue, that attachment is the central foundation from which our mind and all of our relationships develop. I want to explain to you a little bit about the history of attachment theory. Attachment theory was originally created by John Bowlby, who was a ethnologist and psychiatrist in England back in the 1940s. And he did a lot of work with small children who were separated from their caregivers due to World War II. And so he was working and he was starting to notice that children were having specific and unique experiences when separated from their parents. And what's interesting is that back in that date and time, in the 40s and 50s, there was a belief that children were predominantly to be seen and not heard. Children's minds and emotions really were unimportant, that all children needed were to be fed, clothed, housed, and just kind of, be quiet, and then you will grow up and help us later. And what Bowlby realized in noticing children who were separated from their caregivers is that they were actually displaying certain behaviors that indicated something bigger was going on, that children were actually having emotional reactions to being apart from their parents. Now, what's interesting is Bowlby's work was many years ago, almost 100 years ago, but there has actually been an explosion in attachment-based research in the last decade or two, I would say. So when we're talking about what is this attachment thing, and are all relationships attachment relationships? So I want to just focus for a moment on what makes attachment relationships different and so special. Attachment relationships, as I mentioned, have a proximity maintenance quality. Not all relationships are attachment relationships. Friendships are very different from what we would call an attachment relationship. With proximity maintenance, what this means is you have a desire to be close to that person that you have that attachment relationship with. That attachment figure also will be seen as a haven of safety. What that means is that that individual provides protection and comfort when you're distressed. An attachment relationship will also have separation anxiety and separation distress when there is separation. And lastly, an attachment relationship will be what we call a secure base of exploration. An attachment figure is essentially home, a secure base for you in order for you to feel safe enough to step out into the world. So I want you all to think for a moment. Who are your attachment relationships? The way I always ask this question is, if God forbid something horrible were to happen right now, who would be your first phone call? Who would you want to check in with to tell them that you're safe? We mentioned that my son was in the borderline shooting. I was the first person that he called to talk about what happened to him because I am his attachment figure. I'm his mother, but I am the person that he wants to talk to know that he's safe, that there's going to be comfort there. He wanted to come home to be with me because I was his haven of safety. A lot of times our primary attachment figures are our mother and father, but a lot of times they may extend to grandparents, they may extend to other caregivers. As we step into adult relationships, oftentimes our spouses are our attachment figures and they may replace our parents, but a lot of times they don't, especially when we have a loss of a mother or father, maybe even later in life. My mother passed away 2 years ago. And the sadness and the pain with that separation is an indication that she was my primary attachment figure. So if we are talking about attachment, I want you, and I'm probably going to be using the term mother a lot today because research predominantly has been done on mothers as the primary attachment figure. But I do want to say, dads, you have a very critical, important point and part of the attachment dynamic. There just isn't as much research done on you, but dads, you are just as important, especially if there is what we call an insecure attachment with mom. Dads can step in and really help the mental health of a child by being an additional secure attachment to a child. Okay, so next we're going to talk more about attachment and Bowlby's work. So when John Bowlby was working with children, he was working in hospitals, actually, where children were to be separated from their parents. He also did original work in ethnology, where he was looking at animal behavior and started to notice that attachment behaviors extend across the species. This is what gives our secular friends the idea that it is tied to evolution. I just believe God knew he had a good thing going, and so he extended it across all species. So if we look at attachment behaviors early on in life, we see with an infant, to know if there's an attachment bond between that infant and that caregiver, you will see that infant will engage in smiling when they see that attachment figure. They will coo, they will babble. One of the other things that's particularly key is the crying. Infants cannot speak with language as we do. They speak a language of emotion. An emotion of crying is actually their way of communicating to their mother, to their primary caregiver, that something is wrong. And that is an attachment behavior to bring the mother to the child. So that is a critical cue that the infant gives. So when we ignore a child's crying, which I never recommend, and I know that there's some parenting that say, oh, let your child cry it out, what you're doing is you're ignoring a primary attachment behavior. It's a communication that is critical for the development of a secure attachment, and we're going to see later how that develops the brain. Going back to Bowlby, in his work with hospitalized children, let me explain to you what hospitals were like back in the 40s and 50s. They're not like we have today with NICUs, and parents can stay with their children, or pediatric units where parents can spend the night with the children, because we now recognize the importance of parents being there when children are distressed in the hospital. Back in the day, they would maybe have one pediatric hospital in an entire country. So if a child had a significant physical problem, the parents would travel miles and miles and then have to actually leave their children in the hospital alone, often for days, weeks, or months. And so this is where Bowlby was doing his work, and he started to notice that there was actually a very specific pattern that he noticed with children as they were separated from their parents. And he calls these stages of separation. And what he noticed in the first stage of separation is that when the parents would drop off their child, and again, had no basis on age whatsoever, children would protest. That means that they would cry out for their parents, they would be angry. It was an attempt to kind of say, hey, this is uncool. I don't like this. I need you. Why are you going away? They would actually fight for their parent to not leave them. And believe it or not, at this time, this was viewed as something negative of what is wrong with these children? Why are they so upset? Children weren't supposed to really have any emotional needs, so people were kind of baffled by this. And what then Bowlby noticed is the children would protest for a certain period of time, and if the parent did not return, children would step into a phase called despair. And in this despair stage of separation, children would go into almost like a depressed stage. They were not able to be comforted by the staff at the hospital. They were no longer protesting, but they would just sink into this very despairing, depressed state where nobody could help them. And then if the child was still kept there past a certain time, they noticed that the child would, what Bowlby called, step into a stage of detachment. And what was interesting is in this stage, the child seemed to detach from the parent, but at this point be able and willing to be comforted by staff. And so the staff were kind of like, oh yeah, this is a good thing, because now the child is no longer distressed. They will allow us to step in and comfort, but we're going to see in a little bit that this actually was not a good thing. But it was, these stages of separation were the beginnings of understanding, number one, that there is an attachment bond between parent and child, and that when that bond is disrupted by separation, that children get upset. Now, what I want to cover next in terms of attachment is what creates that sense of attachment between parent and child. The most important piece that I want to explain to you is what is called emotional attunement. Emotional attunement is that sense of feeling felt. It's when, for example, you have a talk with a best friend or your spouse and you're like, oh, you get me, and you feel this resonance. That is emotional attunement. Now, when we're talking about infants, as I mentioned, they do not have words, and so their language is one of emotion. And so communication with infants is then conducted through emotional nonverbals, and these are key. This is going to be facial expressions, tone of voice, prosody, volume, gestures. Everything that you do that is nonverbal is going to be communicating with that infant. Because if you think about it, these nonverbal behaviors express your mental state of mind. So, for example, this is my baby. I didn't have a bear, so it's a bunny, but we put down his ears. If you can imagine, this is my baby. And if I'm a new mother, it's so funny, as soon as I picked up the baby, I don't know if any of you noticed that I started to rock. And many of you who are parents will notice as soon as you pick up a baby, you begin to rock. If the baby is crying, the baby is expressing something that is going on with him or her. And so what we as parents need to do to be emotionally attuned, we pick up the baby, and our nonverbal expressions to this child are going to determine the child's state of mind based on our emotional attunement. If the child is screaming, and it's in the middle of the night, and I'm a new mom, and I've gone 3 weeks without any sleep, and I'm exhausted, and I pick up the baby, and I'm just kind of like, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. I'm not going to be very attuned to that child. Now, we've all been there, and we're going to talk about what that's about. But what happens is that is not going to comfort the child because I'm not being attuned. And so what we need to do is check in with what is going on with the baby. And that's why, if you notice, when we pick up a crying baby, our voice changes. Oh, baby, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It's that tone of voice, the prosody, the looking into the eyes. Baby, baby, it's going to be okay. This is emotional attunement, which then provides soothing and comfort. Attuned, what is happening, real quick before I move on, that I have up there is when I'm able to assess what is going on with my infant, I am aligning my mental state with my baby's mental state. My baby's mental state, let's say, is distressed. I know that because I hear the crying, I see the baby's face. When I come, I don't go, oh, it's okay, you're going to be just fine. That's going to distress the baby. I actually mirror what is going on in my infant because that is the attunement. So even though I want my baby to calm down, if I try to give a positive facial expression and different mood, that's actually going to cause my baby to be more distressed. So I am going to align my mental state with the mental state of my infant. So when my infant is distressed, I'm going to look like this, and I am going to, oh, I know the baby is upset, and it's okay, and it's okay. And with that alignment, we're going to see that there's a calming and a soothing. If the baby is happy, we play with the baby like this, and we talk like this. I must seem so strange up here with a bunny, but this is what we do to align the mental states, and this over time creates attachment. When we have this emotional attunement with our infant, it creates what is called contingent communication. Contingent means it is contingent on my mind and the mind of my child. Because the baby is going to do something, I will react. The baby will then react to my reaction. And so we have this contingent communication back and forth that is predominantly one of emotion. So this emotional attunement creates contingent communication that is ultimately going to regulate the child. This process is actually called diatic, which means two, diatic regulation. The mother regulates the child. So when I am attuned and I see what's going on, baby, it's okay. I know. And the baby is still crying. It's okay. What do you have a dirty diaper? Are you hungry? What is it? I'm assessing and attuning to my infant. Over time, if I am attuned to what my baby needs, the child will become regulated and the child will begin to calm down. This is critical for a secure attachment. Now, we're talking about the good parts of attunement. There is also the bad parts of attunement, which is called misattunement. And that's what I was saying. Misattunement is when baby is crying and you've had a bad day, and let's say baby's a little older, maybe the child is now a toddler, and you're just like, I've had it with you, I'm on the phone, leave me alone. Not very attuned. Or when you can't figure out what's going on with the child and there are these moments of misattunement. Those are big moments of misattunement. Sometimes you can't get to your baby because you're in the bathroom or you're on a phone call and you can't get there in time. There are going to be moments of misattunement. Now, the perfectionist that I was growing up, I thought, I had to be attuned to my baby 100% of the time. No. God has given us grace. We can be misattuned, but the key is what is called repair. And again, I think God has given us this construct because this is exactly what he does with us. But we're going to get to that in a minute. A repair looks like I'm misattuning to my infant. I can't figure out what's going on. I'm frustrated. My state of mind is not good. My infant's state of mind is not good. My infant will not get regulated because I'm dysregulated. And so what I need to do as the parent, and this is critical, not the child, the parent, is to create a reparation between our minds. And so what that looks like is if baby is crying and I'm asleep or I'm unavailable and I come running in, oh my gosh, honey, I'm so sorry that I wasn't there for you. Or I'm so sorry I screamed at you. Reparation is what heals the attachment bond because none of us is perfect. We have a capacity to attune, but because we are sinful people, we also have a very strong capacity for misattunement. The key is repair. It is acknowledging when we have failed our children. And I know a lot of people have a hard time with this because this requires a lot of humility. This requires a lot of self-awareness of identifying, oops, I made a boo-boo, and it's my responsibility to tell my child, what, I'm sorry I yelled at you. I really had a bad day. Can you please forgive me? And that's where I do believe that this concept of repair comes from the Lord because that is exactly what he wants with us. We confess our sins to him, and he allows the repair immediately. So what we have to understand is through repeated experiences of attuned and contingent communication with our infants or our children, this results in the diatic regulation of our child. And over repeated, think about these, how many times in a day you have to attune to your child. How many times a day you have to attune to your spouse. It's a lot. Throughout the day, you're going to have tons of attunement, misattunement, and hopefully repair. This is ultimately what is going to create what are called working models in the mind, which we're going to get to. I want to actually backtrack for a second. If we think of what then is a good enough mother, or what is a good enough caregiver? If we have attunement, misattunement, and repair, what would be like a percentage of time that you think we can spend in each one? So I want you to take a moment and think of that for a second. What percentage of the time as a parent do you believe that you have to be attuned to your infant? And what percentage of the time can you be misattuned? Again, I thought in my naivete when I was a young mom, oh my gosh, I have to be attuned like 98% of the time, and there's a little bit of grace here. And what is very cool, they've done research to show a good enough mother is someone who is attuned a third of the time. I know, shocking. Now, that does not mean that you can be misattuned 2/3 of the time. You're allowed to be misattuned a third of the time. But again, the key is you must repair 1/3 of the time. So there's a lot of grace there. And that brought me a lot of hope and a lot of joy, because we're all going to make mistakes. And as a psychologist, I unfortunately bear the brunt of dealing with people who've had a lot of misattunement in their life, where there has not been repair, and trying to help people heal from these wounds. But the good news, again, the key, we want to be attuned, but if we're not, we can repair, and that brings a lot of healing. Okay, I'm going to put you down now. All right. I want to next move to what I was talking about with these internal working models. So, internal working models are mental representations of yourself and others, okay? These are stored very, very deep in the brain, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. They are created outside of these repeated interactions, repeated instances of dyadic regulation. So every time you are attuned and you have contingent communication and you're able to dyadically regulate your child, that is going to form actual rules and kind of a template deep in your brain for how relationships are supposed to be. As I said, they provide rules for relationships, and they have both cognitive and emotional components. So basically, every time you have this interaction with your infant, it is putting a foundation in their brain for future relationships to extend for the rest of their lives. It is the foundation. I talk about it. It's kind of like the wet cement that is ultimately going to be the foundation for relationships for the rest of their lives. Because what happens is, as you attune or misattune, you are actually internalizing the mind of your caregiver. If I have a mind that loves my infant, if I have a mind that wants to soothe my infant, if I have a mind where I am humble and I can acknowledge my wrongdoing with my infant, all of these things are going to be what my infant internalizes. If I am an anxious mom and I'm worried that I'm not good enough, that is going to get internalized into your child. If I'm a frustrated mom and this is a child that I did not want, that is going to get internalized into the child. These internal working models are key, and again, they last the rest of our lives. So moving forward, what is important to determine if we have a secure base? Because remember, that's what we want. We want to feel secure in our relationships with others. We don't want to have to doubt if they're going to be there. Contingent communication, which again is based on that attunement and that kind of dyadic regulation, if we have that, and we have those internal working models, that ultimately creates a secure base. If you do not have a secure base, if you feel anxious, you're not going to want to step out into the world, because the world is a scary place. You don't know what you're going to run into, especially as a small child. But if you know that your mom and dad are there and that they're going to support you and they love you, and even if you make mistakes, there's repair, you're going to feel secure to step out into the world. Now, what is interesting, John Bowlby, kind of the father of attachment theory. He had a student that he worked with who decided to operationalize all of John Bowlby's work. Her name was Mary Ainsworth, and she did a number of studies to operationalize this attachment thing, okay? She called the attachment research project the strange situation, okay? And I'm gonna forward us on that. What she did is she brought in I'm gonna backtrack for a second, a number of mothers and their children. And the children were about 12 to 16 months old. And what she did is she had the mother and toddler at that point sit in a room, and they had that kind of one-way mirror where the researchers were watching what was going on in the relationship between the mother and the child. And they started noticing very predictable patterns of how the mother was relating with her child. It was fascinating. And so what they noted was, the way they called it is A, B, and C. And the first relational dynamic that they found, they labeled avoidant. So what they noticed with these children is mom and child would be in the room together. But what was interesting is there wasn't a lot of interaction between the mother and the child. Mom was maybe reading a magazine, and the child would be like playing with their thing, and the mom would maybe check in occasionally. They would then have the mom get up and leave the room. And they were watching how did the child react to the separation. And then after a few minutes, they would bring the mother back in, and how would the child react to the reunion, which, as you can see, this kind of looks at that attunement, misattunement, repair. Is there attunement between mother and child? How does the child handle the being apart? And is there kind of some repair going on? So in this first category, when mom would leave the room, the child was not distressed, which, think about it. Remember, if we go back to what Bowlby found with his hospitalized children, children are actually supposed to be distressed when they're separated from their parents. That was a novel thing in Bowlby's day, but we now know if a parent leaves a room and leaves a child behind, that is distressing. So what was interesting with these children, mom would leave the room, child barely even noticed. And then mom would come back after a few minutes, and there was really no difference. The child didn't engage with mom. The child just kind of like, oh yeah, okay, whatever, you're back. Didn't even notice you were gone. They labeled these children as having an avoidant attachment style. The next group of children that they noticed, this is the good news, were those they call secure, is that when mom would leave, the child would get distressed. The child would cry, which again, we know is actually evidence that there is an attachment bond, a secure attachment bond. The child should be distressed. When the mother would leave, the child would get distressed, but the child was able to self-soothe. The child was able to calm his or herself enough to continue to play with the toys. And remember that being able to soothe is because of that diatic regulation, that really good stuff that child has gotten from the mother in the first year of life. We see is the beginning of the foundation of the mind, that the child is able to self-soothe because the mother was soothing and comforting much of the time. So when mom would return, the child with the secure attachment would be full of joy, run to mom. There would be a beautiful reunion. And you could see this pattern between mother and child that was contingent. Now, mom wasn't perfect, but there was this back and forth, and that if the child would be upset, the mom would attune to the upset. When the child was happy, the mom would attune to the happiness. It's being sensitive to the child's signals. And when we have that consistently, we create what is called a secure attachment style. The next category that the researchers found was called anxious-ambivalent. In these children, when the mother would leave the room, the children would lose their minds. They would become extremely distressed to the point that they would run after mother, pound on the door. Sometimes they actually even had to like stop the experiment and bring the mom back in because the child was so distressed. But what's interesting, when mom would come back into the room, you would kind of assume, okay, well, they'll calm down now because mom's back. No, actually they saw something different, is that when mom would come back, the child was unable to be comforted in this reunion. In fact, you'd see these kids were mad at mom. They'd sometimes hit her. It's kind of like, why did you leave me? What's going on here? And they would be unable to be comforted. Now, research has shown different types of parenting that go with these three attachment categories. The first one, with the avoidant attachment, we have found mothers who have an avoidant attachment relationship with their child tend to be a little disinterested. They're a little cold, and they're not attuned to their child most of the time. So remember that good enough mother, you've got 30% attunement, 30% misattunement, 30% repair. These moms tend to really be misattuned, and of the belief that, the child should almost kind of raise themselves. And sometimes this can be very subtle, but these moms are very kind of avoidant themselves. And as you can see, they create an avoidantly attached child. Those with the secure attachment, as I mentioned, are very consistent, but they also mess up, but they do the repair. And so they do a lot and enough of that good enough mother stuff. Now, the anxious-ambivalent relationship with their mother is a fascinating one. This is often a very anxious mother who is very inconsistent with her attunement. That sometimes she may be a little bit put off, sometimes she's overbearing, over-mothering, smothering the child, and so the child doesn't quite know what to do. And so a lot of times this mother is so anxious that she won't allow any misattunement to occur, and so the child doesn't know then how to handle misattunement, or there's no repair. There's a lot of inconsistency here. So this was great for research purposes, and this strange situation has been replicated. This was done in the 70s. It has been replicated hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of times, and it has always shown these very consistent. So what's great about this is there's been a lot of research that has been very consistent over time that these three attachment styles kind of exist. And I think I was talking about the anxious-ambivalent tends to be about 15%. Research studies vary, but secure tends to be the most likely attachment style that people will have. But what's interesting, when Mary Main initially did her work, there was a handful of children that could not be classified. And so they just kind of said, yeah, we don't know what's going on with them. They don't fit any of these profiles, so we're just going to kind of stick them in this category of unclassified. And it wasn't until 1980 where Mary Main, who is a psychologist up at Berkeley, she and her colleagues decided, what's going on with these unclassifiable kids? Why are they not fitting? How dare they? They're not fitting into any of these three categories. And so they just decided to study what is going on with them. And what they found is that when there was separation for these toddlers, these children would cry like a securely attached. And so a lot of times I can imagine like the researchers are kind of betting in the back, oh, this one looks secure, what do you think? But what happened is when mom would return, these children would engage in some very odd behaviors. So they would maybe run to mom and then freeze. Or they would go to mom and walk up to her with their back to mom. Or they would run to mom and then drop to the floor. They were engaging in just some baffling behaviors. What Mary Main and her colleagues found, and what they decided, is that this group of infants they decided to call disorganized-disoriented. That they would be moderately distressed by separation, But they would have this very unpredictable, unstable, or fearful response upon reunion with their mom. What Mary Main, again, and her colleagues have subsequently done in looking at what is going on with these infants, why are they behaving this way? They actually would go into houses and really try to look to see what is going on between these infants and their moms. And they have found that approximately 80% of children diagnosed with a disorganized attachment style are being maltreated or abused. So if you think about it, it makes sense. If our attachment figure is supposed to be our secure base, we are supposed to seek proximity for protection and to feel safe. But what happens if our attachment figure is the source of fear? You're going to see an infant that is afraid of being in the world, of being alone in this room, and then seeing their parent wanting to run to the parent for safety, but then it's like all of a sudden they remember, uh-oh, this is my source of fear. So it kind of makes sense of their behavior, why they'd run and then kind of freeze of like, oh yeah, I want to be safe, but I forgot you're not safe. Or they would come at the parent like this of going like, oh, please don't hurt me. What they started noticing is that these children are responding to their caregivers' frightening behavior. And so this is termed fright without solution. A child who has a disorganized attachment has this fear of, the big scary world. Let me run to my caregiver, but they're scary too. What do? I'm an infant. God created me as a baby. I can't manage life by myself. What do? They are dealt a very difficult hand at a very small age where they can't find a solution. The avoidants find the solution of like, peace out, you're unstable, you don't care about me, so I won't care about you, I'm just gonna focus on my toys. The anxious-ambivalent has figured out, Mom, you are so unpredictable that I am actually gonna, try to become real big to get your attention so I can get some consistency. The disorganized child has no solution because their parent is the threat. What is interesting, subsequent to that research, they've done more current research where, again, they're just looking at these disorganized infants, and they said, what if, because again, it's not 100% of them are being maltreated. So they weaned out all the maltreated infants, and they're like, what's going on with this like 20% that's left over? What they have found is these children, they did a research study of, again, going into the house, determined these kids are not being abused at all. And they said, when we do the strange situation, we should only have secure, avoidant, anxious, ambivalent, right? Because none of the kids are being abused. They still ended up with what we call D babies. They still had some of these disorganized babies. They're like, what's going on here? And this is fascinating. They found out there is another way that you can gain this disorganized attachment style, and that's having a parent with unresolved grief, loss, or trauma. This is important because if you are an individual who has unresolved grief, loss, or trauma, and there's many of us, what's going on in your mind? When you hear an infant cry, it's going to create a distress in you. And if you have not done enough work to be able to heal your own mind around distress, what are you going to do with your infant? So if I have unresolved trauma and my baby's crying or my baby's mad at me, I might get scared of this baby who's kind of freaking me out. And so I'm going to be looking at this baby as if this baby is kind of toxic because this baby is making me stressed. Can you imagine looking into my face as an infant? Every time you cry, you get this? Because remember, my mind is going to be now in his or her mind. I am going to be scared of my infant. This is terrifying for the foundation of the child. Or I may see my infant as my perpetrator and not consciously noticing this, but having distress, and that child has no safe place to go. Lastly, I want to talk for a moment, and then we're going to tie up the rest of attachment, about these internal working models. Internal working models are very concrete because the baby's brain does not have the capacity for abstract thought. So, through these repeated interactions between mom and child, the child is going to begin to internalize a view of themselves and a view of other people. And these are those rules for relationships that are going to be maintained throughout the rest of their life. So, let's start off with our avoidant attached child. If consistently I have a mom that dismisses me, I am going to have to create my own fantasy world of that. And what we find with those who are avoidantly attached is that they have a positive view of themselves and a negative view of others. Yeah, mom, yeah, she was just never around, whatever. I don't need people, whatever. And I am fine on my own. And that's somebody, and you can even see this in adulthood, those who are avoidantly attached tend to be very dismissing. I don't need anybody. I've got it down. Thank you very much. I'm not going to allow myself to be dependent. I'm not going to allow myself to need anybody because everybody is going to, nobody's going to be there for you anyway, so don't even bother. I can handle myself. Thank you very much. Those who have a secure attachment, because they've got this consistent interaction that is attuned with their primary caregiver, have a positive view of themselves and a positive view of others. When I get upset, I know that somebody will be there to soothe me because that's been my experience. I know that I am worth attaching to, I am worth being in a relationship with. And I also know, you know what, you're not that bad yourself. You may make some mistakes, but overall, we're going to have a good relationship, and that will be a secure foundation for relationships for the rest of my life. Our anxious-ambivalent tend to have a negative view of self and a positive view of others. And so what this looks like is there's something wrong with me that you can't be consistent with me because you've got something I need, so you must be withholding it. Because there's something that I'm not doing. And so people with this anxious-ambivalent attachment tend to have very kind of volatile relationships because they tend to often choose those who have avoidant attachment styles, and they kind of recreate a lot of what they had going on in childhood. But this anxious-ambivalent will believe you can give me what I need. You can have this relationship with me, but there's something wrong with me that you won't love me. There's something wrong with me. I am innately flawed. I know you're going to leave me. And then lastly, our disoriented, attached individuals have a negative view of self and a negative view of others because, again, that has been their experience. Other people are scary and dangerous. They're not going to be able to give me what I want. But you know what? I am so super flawed that that's a problem as well. Soon, we're going to be talking about how our attachment style affects our relationship with God. But as we step apart from the attachment stuff, I just want to see if there's any questions before I move into our next section, which is going to be talking about the brain. Yes?
So the question is, how does attachment and misattachment happen when there is mental illness or autism?
Okay, question is, what happens to the attachment dynamic when you've got somebody with mental illness or something else going on? It affects it dramatically. There is a powerful video. I was going to show it as part of this talk, but it is actually so emotionally powerful. I didn't want to freak you all out. But if anybody is interested, you can go onto YouTube and put in the still-faced experiment by Ed Tronick. It's like the second video that'll pop up on YouTube. And what Ed has done in his work with infants is he has, again, the mother and the infant, and you see a beautiful interplay back and forth of the attunement, and the child points and the mom looks up, and it's just a beautiful dance between mother and infant. And then Ed says to mom, okay, it's time for still face. And mom turns around, and this is how she comes back. no matter what the infant does, the mother has still face. What you see, and that still face, researchers believe, is tied often to autism, depression, somebody who's postpartum, tragically. You have a mother who's still faced. The infant then will seek to do the repair because the infant's getting total misattunement. And so the infant will be like, hey, mom, yo, come back. You were just here. Hello. And you can actually see the infant trying to seek out, mom, where are you? Where are you? And mom remains distressed. The next thing that you see is the child becomes extremely distressed, where the child will start to cry and get louder and bigger. Why aren't you paying attention to me? Hey! You see the child get very distressed. Mom remains still faced. You then see the child disengage and turn away from the mom, which is actually, if you think about it, synonymous with our attachment styles, that initially there's that anxious, hey, come back. And when mom is still faced, the child, it's so disturbing for a child to have a parent that is checked out that the child literally will turn its head. The Tronic video ends there, thank God, because when you watch it, it's very disorienting, and you see the mother repairs, and it's beautiful. But research has shown just even sustained periods of still face like that can have a devastating effect on the mind. I watched a video at a conference once that extended the video longer. Not only did the child turn around, the child, after a certain period of time, collapsed into a feigned death state, where the child completely disengaged. And then we've got some serious problems because that's doing profound damage. So I don't know if that answers the question. I can take another one.
Sure. What does attachment theory have to say about differences in class, such as what if those of lower classes can't attend to their child as those with more privilege?
Great question. What is interesting is a lot of Bowlby's original work was done in indigenous countries where, they had all different kinds of attachment relationships. There is research that has shown about, let's say, children that have to go into daycare. Those separations matter based on the reunion. So if you have a securely attached relationship with your child, it's not that time apart doesn't matter. It's that the child has enough internal security that mom and dad are going to be there, everything is going to be okay. So research has actually shown, and this is what is unbelievable, is that these attachment styles and these attachment relationships are consistent across the board. It doesn't matter class, it doesn't matter ethnicity, none of these things really matter. It's not tied to genetics, it is literally what goes on. And so you're going to have secure relationships, upper class, lower class, it doesn't matter. It comes down to what's going on in the mind of the primary caregiver. That's really what's key. So even if you're not with that child all the time, it's the mind of the caregiver that is going to determine the security of the relationship. Now, ideally, you would like to have the child have a secure attachment with, let's say, a caregiver if they're in daycare or something like that. That would be ideal. But children can be very resilient. And that's where I was saying earlier that a child can have an insecure attachment with one parent and a secure attachment. It's insecure with one and a secure with other, and it can be very helpful. I don't know if I answered that, but I can maybe take one more. Is there any more?
Sure, one more. Okay. How does personality come into play with attachment styles? Can a child be avoidant even when with attuned parents? My kids fit into 3 different attachment styles.
Interesting. Again, research has shown that personality does not tie into attachment styles. Now, different children have different temperaments. But again, temperament, there is not a correlation between temperament and attachment style, which I found to be interesting. Children are born each unique. We're not born as a blank slate. We all have temperament that kind of sets us up when we're born. But it's the attachment style. So if you have a different attachment style with a different child, I would look at what was going on when each one of those children were born, what was going on with you. So for example, when I was born, I think I had a lot of really good stuff from my mom. When my mom was 6 months pregnant with my sister, her mother died. And she and her mother were inseparable. There are photos of my mother, actually not many of my sister, her first year of life, but at my sister's first or second birthday, I think it's her first birthday, you can see my mom is so depressed that I believe my sister and I have very different attachment styles based on that loss that my mom had at such a critical time. So I would encourage people to look at not necessarily personality characteristics in their children, but what was going on in you when you had your children. So if it's okay to move on, how much time do I have before our break? 5 minutes. Oh, okay, we're gonna jump into the brain real quick. I'm gonna take you back to our painting that I showed you at the beginning, The Creation of Adam by Michelangelo, and I want to read you an excerpt by Dr. Frank Meshberger. He said, in 1990, Dr. Frank Lynn Meshberger described what millions had overlooked for centuries, an anatomically correct image of the human brain was portrayed behind God. I'm not going to go into specific details because it's very neurologically deep. But there are many brain structures depicted in this painting with some interesting correlations to brain functioning. So according to Dr. Meshberger, if you look at the painting, below the right arm of God is a sad angel in an area of the brain that is sometimes activated on PET scans, which are brain scans, when someone experiences a sad thought. We also see that God is superimposed over the limbic system, which is the emotional center of the brain, and possibly the anatomical counterpart of the human soul. You see that God extends his right arm into what is called the prefrontal cortex, which we are going to learn is the key to being a mature and righteous person. So even back in the day, Michelangelo was aware that God resides in our brain and the seat of our consciousness is in the mind, not in the body. I believe God gave him that very cool insight. I want to real quickly go over the brain because it is important for our talk. In the brain, we have 100 billion neurons, thousands of interconnections, and millions of firing patterns. And I'm going to actually teach you how to understand the brain in the palm of your hand. So what I want everybody to do at home, put up your hand. You guys can do it here too. Put your thumb over and cover it. This is our brain very much like what is on the screen. The lowest part of the brain, which on the screen is brown, is the brain stem and the cerebellum. That is right here. So if this is our brain, our eyes are here, this is the top of our head, this is the back of our head, this is our spinal cord. Right here. This is the lowest part of the brain, what people call the reptilian brain. It regulates our physiological states. Breathing, heart rate, temperature, things like that. And now I want you to open your hand. This is representing that kind of red-orange color on the picture. This right here is the limbic system, and it includes the amygdala, the hippocampus, the cingulate gyrus, the thymus. This area mediates emotion, motivation, memory, and self-regulation. Now, what's interesting is where your thumb is, that is where your amygdala is. And if you notice, the amygdala is touching the center of your palm, which is actually connected to that lower part of your brain. Amygdala is the fear center. What happens when we're afraid? It activates our heart rate, everything in our breathing, which then down-regulates the body, okay? The highest part of the brain, the blue in our slide, is called the neocortex. And this mediates complex and abstract processes. And one of the pieces that's very important for our talk today is called the prefrontal cortex, which is right in the front, kind of right behind your forehead, because that is a critical part of higher functioning, and it is critical for our relationship with others and with God. So real quick, I'm going to go over what the prefrontal cortex does. It regulates the body. It regulates emotions. It is responsible for that attuned communication. It is responsible for response flexibility, which means if you were going to respond and you're like, and you can actually not, that's a function of the prefrontal cortex. I always say prefrontal cortex is kind of the adult. It's like what we want our teenagers to have. It's that adult part of our brain that I think a lot of people are aware is now we've determined not fully functioned until age 25. So this is what we want our teenagers to have. That's what I always kind of think if you're wondering what prefrontal cortex does. It's responsible for empathy, insight, and self-understanding. Fear extinction, so calming ourselves when we are afraid, intuition, and morality. All the good stuff that we all want to be, right? Our brain is also comprised of two hemispheres. We have a left hemisphere and we have a right hemisphere. And come on, here we go. Our left hemisphere, the way to remember it, left starts with L. It's logical, linear, and it's where language resides. So that left hemisphere is responsible for our conscious responses, and it also is the seat of what we call explicit memories. Explicit memories are memories when you have a very distinct sense of recalling something. It does not come online until you're about 2 years old. And in order for things to be encoded, you have to focus on it to remember it. So when I say, what did you have for dinner last night? Every one of you should be going, dinner. Yes, I had, okay, this is what I had. That is an explicit memory. You can go back and find it. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is responsible for more emotional things. It's called the emotional brain. And in the right hemisphere, we have what are called implicit memories. And with implicit memories, there is no sense of recalling. You can't just say, gosh, well, I'll talk about this in a second. So there is no sense of recalling, and it's online at birth, and some are actually saying in utero. There are current studies now showing babies are connected to their mom, and they will have memories implicit of being in utero. So if a mother goes through a traumatic event when she's pregnant, an infant will actually internalize and remember implicitly what happened in utero. It does not need focal attention to encode, and this is what is key. Implicit memories tend to be behavioral, emotional, perceptual, and somatosensory, meaning they're stored in the body. So when I ask you, remember the smell of rain. We can all smell that rain, right? Now tell me, when did you remember that? You can't. It's a sensory memory. How do you know how to ride a bike? Do you remember the first time you ever rode a bike? But your body has muscle memory. These are implicit memories. Another example of implicit memory are those working models that we have in our brain that determine our relationships, okay? I think we're gonna have to stop for now. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the neurobiology of attachment. And then we're going to be moving a little bit into really the meat of this talk. So what I want you guys to do while you're at your break, think about what is my attachment style? And I want you to begin to think, what might my attachment style be to God? And I'll see you in 10 minutes.